Hello, everybody. It's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game and Fire Mad Productions. So today's video is about, I haven't done one in a little while, so thought I would do one. This is about the subject of immersion, how to create immersion, immersiveness in tabletop role-playing games. Some little tricks I've learned over the years of doing this. I've been doing this for a while, and some game design. Also pulling it from acting stuff that I do, theater and film. And so I think all of that together can kind of be focused into a narrative about immersion. So here's a few tricks. I've got like 10 basic things here in a little outline here. So 10 basic points. Now there's going to be a bunch of sub points within these little 10. So I want to go into some detail, right? But I don't want to make the video massively long. Maybe I'll do a part 2 later on if I come up with some more material. But I think the 10 stuff I have plotted out will be very helpful for you as a game master and even a player. I want to preface that before I go into this, that I think a lot of impetus and a lot of focus and a lot of pressure is put upon game masters, right, or dungeon masters if you're doing D&D specifically, to run a game and to be the storyteller and the manager, the stage manager and the director and the supporting actors at the same time. And that's all well and good because there should be a fair amount of pressure for that. It's like a fairly serious gig, right? You're kind of in charge of this whole thing for the most part. However, let's remember that players also need to contribute as well. They're not just sitting there at the table, right? They need to be interactive as well, right? That's part of the give and take of the experience. The ebb and flow, the give and take, the reception and the giving. It's very, if you've studied any kind of improv, it's very much like that, where everybody is clicking together to tell the story. When I say together, it doesn't necessarily mean there's not conflict, but there's friendly conflict, right? We're all setting each other up. We're all sort of helping each other. If you're playing a character um, that's slightly competitive with another character, that's all well and good, but just do it in a mature, thoughtful way, right? Think about people are sitting around the table like you are, wanting to engage in this activity, right? They've chosen to do that instead of the other 46 things they could have been doing. So with that being said, remember that this is mostly for game masters, but it's also maybe a little bit for player characters as well, just to kind of think about, to consider. Okay, right, going right into it. So number one, atmosphere. And this is specifically about the physical real world atmosphere. For example, where are you holding the game? Is it around a traditional table? Dining room table is kind of the sort of traditional tabletop. That's why it's called tabletop gaming. Uh, the old sort of old school way of thinking about it, which is pretty accurate in many ways, is playing down in a basement, right? Like in Stranger Things, the Hellfire Club. When I was those kids' age in real life, yeah, we were doing that. We were gaming down in basements and stuff. It was kind of fun because it was almost like being in a dungeon, right? So pay attention about your physical setup, your physical world if you're looking for immersion, which I think everyone should strive for some degree of immersion. Um, if you want some really deep immersion, you could do stuff like candles. You could have incense going. You could have various medieval props or whatever the setting is. It doesn't have to be medieval. If it's an old west game, if you have some things from the old west, some antiques or something, guns or something. If it's a science fiction game, if you have any kind of sci-fi looking props, or if you want to make some cheap ones or something like that, posters with the art. So right now I'm talking about physical real world atmosphere, and that can kind of help. Now you don't necessarily need all of that, especially the next 9 things that I'm going to get into will help you. It'll be awesome without even having any of that. I don't use a lot of that honestly. So in my previous places that I've lived, I've usually had my own game room. I don't really have one in this lovely house that we have here. It's great. I mean, I could probably do one, but we live kind of out far away, kind of in the boonies on purpose, out in the mountains. We love it out here, and so it's not really a central place to gather. So when I run games, 99.9% of the time, oh, 99, I say that 1% is online. I'm going to other people's houses. My in-person Savage Kingdoms group meets at one of my players' offices, and it's like great because there's no distractions. Um, and in the past, I've met at other players' areas and stuff. Now, a couple of my past friends in Atlanta, like my friend Tim in particular, had like a nice setup down in his basement. Had some medieval artwork and torches on the wall and weapons and stuff, and that was kind of cool. And it really did kind of add to the immersiveness, at least to kind of kick it off. So if you want medium to heavy, if you really want that kind of immersion, that's a good way to kind of start. However, that's not necessary. I mean, I've run pretty immersive games at Dragon Con or at small conventions where it's literally just a table and you've got random people that show up for 4 hours. It all goes back to what I said at the beginning of this video. It really comes down to how the players are clicking together. And I'm talking about the players clicking together, being collectively, being respectful of each other, trying to tell a collective story, not necessarily the characters. The characters can have conflict. In fact, it's far more fun when the characters have a little bit of conflict. It doesn't mean they're doing, what's the term the kids always use, PvP, player versus player. It doesn't have to be that in a video game sense where you're literally swinging a giant axe at someone's head that you were just friendly with 2 seconds ago. I think it's better when there's a lot of role playing and it's more of a realistic dialogue going back and forth. And maybe weapons do get drawn. Maybe there's a duel, like maybe there's a single combat and they're going to figure it out instead of just this random brawl that just brings anybody in. So before I get off completely off topic on that, there's some other videos I've done about that, and maybe I'll do some future ones. Let me get back to what I was talking about. So, atmosphere, real world, just make sure your setup is, if it's not necessarily immersive with all these props and stuff that I talked about, make sure it's kind of, at least it's like nice and pleasant for the most part, and that there's limited distractions. So, yeah. And before I move on, Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or any other virtual tabletop system, it kind of goes for the same thing. So we're all playing in different spaces, right? If I run a fairly good bit on Roll20, Dungeons and Dragons for youth, and also occasionally some Savage Kingdoms online. I need to get back to doing that, honestly. It's been quite a few months, 6 or 7 months since I've done a live play. But the general rules kind of stay true. So when I'm running on Roll20, I try to make sure my general space, which is pretty much what you see, I'm at my desk, or at least the main area that I'm usually at, gaming or even writing in my house. So this area behind me is kind of my space. And so the other players, it's kind of on them to have their space that they're not being too distracted. So lack of distraction does help in immersion. So it's definitely connected. If you're being distracted, I'm going to get to more of that in a second, but if you're distracted by a dog barking or a kid calling your name or something, that's fine. Real world stuff happens. But see if you could try to limit it so that we can all collectively create immersion, right? All right, so moving on to number 2. Setting. The setting, a big thing. So we went over physical atmosphere was number 1. Now we're at number 2. This is more like, this would be in-game atmosphere. Would be another, the setting, right? The setting that you're in. So make sure it's, let's see, what did I write? Make sure it's conveyed to players. Yeah, so that was a little note to trigger me to talk about this. So make sure your setting, your in-world, your in-game atmosphere setting is known to the players. And I know it sounds kind of like a no-brainer, but maybe, like you sit down to the table and you're playing Starfinder, which is Pathfinder in space, right? So most people are going to know this is like science fiction, even though there's a little bit of fantasy elements kind of thrown in. But for the most part, it's a science fiction game. However, if the players aren't that familiar with the setting, the game master might go into like a little 5-minute spiel. Don't spend a lot of time on that, but just kind of a 2-minute spiel about here's kind of the expectations, here's the general thing about the setting. And once people get in their noggins, their heads about what the setting is, what the in-game atmosphere is like, or even the themes of the campaign, that totally helps with immersion, because hopefully a good player is trying to hone down their quote performance, their playing ability into what you are describing, to do with the setting. For example, if I'm running an Old West game, if I'm running my Mythic West game or something like that, for example, or Deadlands or something, and a person comes to the table and wants to play a Spanish swashbuckler, well, that can almost work setting-wise. It's a little come beyond the period of what we think about the golden age of piracy, but typical swashbuckling. But you could probably make it work. However, it doesn't really quite fit. I mean, you really have to kind of tweak it. So knowing what the setting is allows the players to make more informed choices, and therefore all of that leans into immersion at the table and in our heads, because tabletop role-playing game, 95% of this story, this is in our heads, right? We use miniatures and maybe even terrain pieces to kind of help us, but those are called game aids. They're not necessity. They're not a necessity to the game. They're not necessary. You can run a really immersive. In fact, in many cases, I will say, theater of the mind can be even more immersive if it's done correctly. If it's done uh, with some more tips that I'm about to get into. So make sure everybody knows about the setting for the most part. The game master definitely needs to know the setting, so it's definitely on the game master. Know what you're running, know about the world that you're in. When I run Savage Kingdoms, I'm very fortunate, and I'm the author of that setting. So not only do I have the stuff in the books, but I have like 50 times more stuff that's even in my head that hasn't been written out or published, but I know what's in there. So that's actually very helpful. That's a little bit of a cheat. So if you're running something that you did not create, if it's not your own setting or your own system or both, you probably have to do a little more research as a game master, be a little more prepared. So the more you're prepared, the more you will be able to immerse yourself and therefore your players into the game. So respect the setting. Oh, right. Yes. Moving on to number three. Number three, I have respect the setting and with it the rules in like smaller letters. Okay, so what that is, to unpack that a little bit. Respect the setting is kind of a little bit to number two. The reason I made it is number three, like its own thing, is because it kind of isn't its own thing, but it means that you as the game master and the players are respecting the setting. And it kind of goes back to that example I said, that guy wanted to play a Spanish swashbuckler in an Old West game. So be respectful of the setting. Like your game master is like, this setting is golden age of pirates. So don't probably play a Roman legionnaire, right? That'd be great for Savage Kingdoms, that type of character, but for a golden age of piracy setting, it doesn't really fit. So that means respect the setting. So if you don't really like the setting that the game master, I know this is a shocker, maybe don't play it, right? Or ask your game master if they don't, maybe later on down the road, if request that they run this different type of scenario or this different type of adventure or campaign or whatever. But if the game master has gone to all this trouble and has included you, invited you to play, and be respectful of the setting and try to create a character that fits in the setting, it makes it so much more collectively immersive for everybody else. Case in point, like so Savage Kingdoms is you can tell by the title, right? It's a pretty serious game. I mean, we have fun, we all joke and stuff, but it's a fairly gritty, dark ages kind of setting, almost sword and sorcery setting. So, and a lot of the players I play with are fellow actors, and we can get pretty immersed into a role, and we're doing some fairly serious acting, so to speak, or at least role playing. And then sometimes like a new player would join us, and they're playing like this kind of silly character or whatever. Now, silliness can be fine within the context of the setting. Say you want to play a 12-year-old boy, 12-year-old child, 11-year-old, 10-year-old child. You totally can in Savage Kingdoms, and probably in D&D, I guess you can too. Some of your ability scores are probably lowered or whatever, but you could. And within the context of being maybe a younger character, you could be a little silly, right? Because you're still exploring your world, you're still making a little comment. You don't really know what's going on half the time. And that's kind of like the way you engage with your world, right? Just like in the real world. Or you play maybe an old crotchety hermit who's kind of weirdly funny, but connected to the setting, right? You can still, just because you play in a darkly medieval setting doesn't mean, I mean, people had a sense of humor back then, believe it or not, way back, probably in some ways better than we do nowadays, honestly. So people enjoyed humor. They enjoyed hubris and perform, to kind of get away from their daily lives on occasion. So humor was a thing, right? But contextual humor creates immersion, All right, so that's respecting the setting, and with it, and then I put a little note about with it the rules, and I think I was just trying to remind myself to speak on the fact that with the setting, often the rule system is tied with the setting, not always. Savage Kingdoms is definitely another example. Call of Cthulhu is a definitely example, even though there's a D20 and a D100 BRP system. They're still fairly deeply woven into the fabric of the setting, and there's some other game systems too that the system and the setting are almost like two different. I mean, they're together, right? Dungeons and Dragons is an anomaly, right? For a reason. You can apply the 5e system to a lot of different settings, right? You do have to do some work, obviously, because even Dungeons and Dragons itself is I mean, Forgotten Realms is kind of the default, right? But there's 8 or 9 other fairly well-known published settings. Um, So yeah, just respect the setting and therefore with it the rules, because in many cases the rules are there to support the atmosphere and the setting that you're doing. At least that's how I design games. Okay, moving to number 4, other tips for creating immersion in your tabletop role-playing game experiences. Character names, use them. That's what I wrote. Old trick of mine I've been doing forever. Use the characters' names at the table whenever you, almost always. Um, Even when I'm talking in game mechanics, I will be like, let's roll for initiative. Okay, what did Talendrian get? I won't say what did Scott get or what did Maria get or whatever. I almost always try to use character names, and that kind of puts into the players' brains that, yeah, that's right, that's my character's name. Because you'll be surprised how many people come to the table with this fairly elaborate character and they forgot their character name. I mean, they've probably written it down, but I'm just saying, like right off the top of their head, they have to look at the character sheet. A little ridiculous, but it's fun. It happens, and maybe they put a lot of work in other stuff and just the name. Often we name characters like towards the end of the character creation process anyway, so it kind of makes sense. But so if the game master continues to use the characters' names in almost all cases, not obviously there's some out of game, like if somebody, hey David, while you're using the restroom, we're going to do this. I probably wouldn't say, hey Talendrian, while you're using the restroom, we're going to continue this scene, because I'm not talking to the character. I'm talking to the player going to the bathroom or getting a drink for somebody or letting his dog out or whatever. But in most cases, use the character's name, um, and try to get beyond the kind of very early first edition role playing thing. Well, and people still do it with 5e. Um, the thief. What did the thief roll? What did the cleric? What did it? It's like, don't try to get deeper. Use the characters' names. Besides, you might be, particularly in some games where those concepts can be similar. Like don't say the thief or the cleric or the fighter. It's like these characters have like lives, right? They have actual names. So game masters show a little respect for the names, and also it helps you in return. So part of that little trick is to remind me what the character's name is. So if I continue to say it over and over, and I've usually got it written down in my notes, it puts in my head. I associate that player with that character name. So just a little trick. Definitely helps in immersion. Makes it feel much more of a real kind of experience. Okay, moving on to number 5, descriptive words. So kind of similar to the character name thing, and I put use them with few modernisms. Okay, so another little trick of mine. So I will try to use language that is indicative of the setting. My preferred setting is medieval fantasy, particularly more of like a Dark Ages, ancient world setting. And I try to use words that invoke that. For example, if I'm describing something large, I'm not going to say it's as large as a truck, because that is a modernism. Now, if we were playing a science fiction setting, I might say that, or a modern setting, because it's a modern item. But in a typical sort of medieval-ish esque game, try to avoid it's as large as a refrigerator. You can probably get away with that once or twice in a game system, but I would try not to do it at all. Always try to relate stuff to the setting. It will help with immersion. It keeps people focused into what's going on. They don't have to suddenly go back, giant refrigerator truck, and now we're dealing with swords and battle axes. Like, what's going on? So it's called a disconnect, right? You don't want to have as many disconnects. You don't want to try to have any disconnections. So yes, use descriptive words. And if it's in a darker setting, use evocative words. Blood is an obvious one, but use things that are connected to that word, like the crimson or red or scarlet. Um, those are very, very descriptive and very illustrative words. Or steel or hard or iron. So there's a lot of words, and I could probably do a whole video about this. There are very specific words that evoke images in people's heads. Symbols are very much that way too, which is why heraldry was such a cool thing. It literally would invoke, it's been proven the human mind retains symbols, particularly certain shapes, are very powerful imagery, because that is the early form of language, right? Before written letters and runes are just symbols, right? And then they string together to make sounds or whatever, depending on the language. Um, so yeah, with that in mind, symbols and specific words, particularly adjectives, very descriptive adjectives, will anchor stuff into players' heads, at least kind of giving them a general idea. Particularly if you're playing in theater of the mind and you're not relying on miniatures and stuff as much, you have to be almost a little more descriptive. You want to uh, let the players know what's happening, right? So the trick of that also is not to go overboard. Do not go too much in the description. That was a flaw of mine in the past. I would almost be too much descriptive. Not almost. I was. So I've learned to kind of be descriptive, and I almost have kind of figured out where the cutoff point is. Now, part of that is called reading the room, kind of looking at your players. And some of them are like, "Oh my god, this is so boring," and they're like tapping their pencils and looking at their phones or whatever. And that might be a tell that maybe you need to shut up on the. Now, it could be just them being unfocused and being disrespectful, but most of the time, it's probably them kind of giving you a social cue that, "All right, dude, yeah, we've had enough of the 2 minute description. I would like to say what I want to do." But you're hopefully doing that in order to give them more to work with. Right? So players sometimes will make a decision before you're even done, and you're like, "Do you know the con?" I mean, I've literally had to go, "Let me finish saying because what you're about to do, apparently, you probably wouldn't do once I get the entire description out. If you want to after, that's fine, that's cool. But I just want to be fair and let you know what's going on. I haven't described the pool of acid yet, so whatever the case is, right?" So, using descriptive words, verbiage, that sort of thing. Um, yeah, I think I've hit that horse enough, right? So, certain words. Uh, if it's a science fiction setting, try to use what's the term? Techno babble. Um, I mean, a lot of the techno babble or technological wording is going to be in the game book, probably. But I remember when I used to run Firefly, I loved it, and they literally had this chart of like random techno babble that you could roll on, and it was like the words didn't necessarily mean anything, but they sounded cool. And so the point of that being that it helped with immersion to kind of help people bring in that world. So yeah, so try to avoid modernisms and use descriptive text that is indicative of the setting, right, in the era. All right, moving on to number 6. Do research on the era, setting, etc. So, all right, so what that is for this is particularly for game masters, but also for players too, because again, you guys don't get a free ride too. You got to pull something. You got to do some work, right? You got to do something. But mostly it's for GMs, game masters. So meaning that I've run into a fair amount of game masters in my life, and I've been a victim of it a couple times too, where I'm like, yeah, I'll run a game, sure, whatever. And I probably didn't really do the research as much as I wanted to on the setting or system, which is usually the case. Now, if it's a medieval setting or Dark Ages setting, I'm pretty confident. I know a good bit about that era, not everything certainly, but enough to kind of run a game on. Now, if it's some other setting, I'm not like steampunk is not really my thing. So if I were to run a game, I would have to probably do some research, right? But that's easy to do. We have the internet nowadays, and yes, granted, there's lots of disinformation and misinformation on the internet too. But with any kind of wisdom and some patience, you can usually weed through all the BS, and you can find like some actual nuggets of fact in there, or at least presumed fact, to kind of run with. So yeah. So for example, if you're not familiar with the we'll just say the Middle Ages, the medieval era, and you're running a medieval fantasy game, because most fantasy takes place in a medieval setting. Not all. Harry Potter is Potter is modern fantasy, for example. If you're not familiar with that setting or not comfortable, then yeah, spend an hour, hopefully more, but at least an hour online, or God forbid, an actual book at a library, and you can just even in an hour or two's time, you can really soak up some really cool facts, at least enough to kind of fake it and kind of bring the setting to life. And also, it makes you look less foolish, right? Because sometimes there'll be a player at your table that really knows a lot about that era, if that's the era that you're basically I know it's fantasy, but that's the general era, right? And they might know all these things, and you're like, I have no idea. So save yourself the embarrassment by looking. And it's fine if you don't know and you ask a player at the table. Say a player at the table is an expert in medieval sailing nautical techniques, and there's a scene where they're sailing or something like that. Feel free to ask that player. But then maybe go home that night after the session and maybe do some research yourself, right? So yeah, don't be lazy. Try to do a little bit of a workload, right? But yeah, don't hesitate to ask other players if that's their specialty about things as well. So yes, do research on the setting. If it's science fiction, then read up on the latest science fiction and speculative theory and stuff like that on space travel and colonizing other worlds. And yeah, you'll find some cool stuff, and it'll also spur your imagination to come up with really cool adventures. And if you're a world builder, building settings and stuff like that. So there's many benefits to doing that research, other than just being a GM and helping to create immersion. All right, moving on to number 7. Number 7, focus at the table. I put at the table in parentheses because sometimes it's online, but same idea. Take planned breaks, etc., etc. All right, so let me go back. So focus at the table. So everybody needs to collectively, as much as possible, we all have distractions. We all have to check our phones on occasion. Someone's in the hospital or whatever. Obviously that's an emergency. Um, Wife is texting to pick up something from groceries, or the husband or whoever. That's fine. Real world stuff happens. But for the most part, when you can, for your part, focus at the table. Certainly as the game master, right? To keep everybody kind of focused. Um, I try my best. I like to cut jokes because I like to have a good time with my friends, and I kind of like humor, or at least my attempt at it. But I do try to minimize it. And what I mean by that, I'm trying to get better. Um, I might I might cut 3 or 4 weird jokes, maybe 5 during a session, but I try not to go too much. So um, I like to be in the moment, pretty serious, depending on the setting, right? Doing my job as a game master and a narrator, running things, and then I might just flip, I might just at the appropriate moment cut a joke to kind of bring everybody to give everybody some relief. And some of that's on purpose for that actual reason. Like maybe we need a break. Maybe there's like this heavy moment of role playing, and maybe you need that kind of like somebody to cut a joke and kind of bring everyone out of it. But you got to be careful with that. Watch your timing, because sometimes scenes get ruined when somebody cuts a joke at an inappropriate time, and there was some like really deep role playing going on, or this really cool action scene or whatever. So, yeah, the overall point of number 7 here is focus at the table as much as possible. I put take planned breaks, so try to. Yeah, we all have to go up, get up, use a restroom, or grab a snack. But if you try as much as possible to maybe take a planned break. I do that definitely with the youth gamers because they like to kind of get up and stuff. I probably should do it more often, honestly. But with adults too, just and you can make that announcement at the beginning of the session. Just tell everybody if you can. Every hour and a half, we're going to take 5 or 10, whatever. Um, and if you can, we'll all work together. Let's all try to use those moments to get up and do stuff. Unless it's emergency, obviously. But yeah, because it just creates more focus at the table. People aren't getting up at random times. I know as a game master, I get a little frustrated having to repeat myself again after what I just described to everybody because somebody was away from the bathroom. So yeah, if there's a concerted focus at the table, it also creates an immersion I guess, for obvious reasons. We're all on the same page. We're in the same moment. We're not having to recreate a moment that was cool by someone being gone, and then it's never quite as cool as the first time it actually happened, etc. That's all that storytelling stuff. Moving on to number 8. Right. Number 8 is character voices and dialects, of course. So if you like to use voices and dialects, that is great. If not, don't worry about it. So, and I know this is like kind of a big deal and also like a weird thing for most people. So a lot of people put emphasis on this, like especially when somebody's like, "Well, you're an actor, you get to do all these, you do these dialects." I'm like, well, that's part of it, but that's really not. That's kind of like secondary or tertiary, honestly. Like as an actor and even as a role player, there's far more important things than doing a voice or a dialect or an accent or a dialect. However, that can enhance your experience if you can do it pretty well and not be silly about it. There's a rule in theater and in film that if you're trying to enact an accent for your character, a dialect is what we usually like to call it, you should be about 90% accurate, 85 maybe. If you're about 50% of what that accent, then don't do it at all. And so I would suggest that as a player at a table. I know this is role playing and it's not really theater necessarily, but it does use a lot of those techniques. Or do it. It's fine. So the reason I say don't do it is because it can distract, and it can pull focus, and people are now focusing on the fact that your accent's not great instead of what you're saying. That's the whole reason that kind of rule is there, theatrically speaking. But the cool thing about it at tabletop role playing game is that I like when somebody says something and I know that that's in character and not out of character. So if you can't do a really good dialect or accent, there are other tricks around it. You can modulate your voice and be more like William Shatner, kind of going back and forth, Spock 367 crewmen on. So you can, that's a little much. But you can modulate your voice. You can, maybe that's how your character talks. Or you just lower your voice and maybe you're not doing an accent, but it's just a deeper way of talking. Or it's a higher way of talking. I don't know. I mean, just, do something that indicates to the game master that you're in character. So that when you say something out of character, it's more clear. Now, most of the time, you can usually tell if somebody's like it's kind of obvious if someone's talking out of character. Game master, is that on page 372? Obviously, the player said that and not the character. However, there are times where I'm like that. I'm not quite sure because that person sounds exactly the same as their character. So I'm not quite sure. But anyway, the point is because this is about immersion, character voices and dialects, if you're comfortable doing them and they're pretty good and they're not too distracting, they can really create another level, another layer of immersion. Um, yeah, if you're comfortable and people are comfortable with you doing it and nobody's like making like offhanded silly comment about it, it can really become a part of your character, and you as the player doing the voice can you get some confidence with it and really kind of explore that character even more just from their dialect, which is it's really cool. And again, connect the dialect back to the setting. So going back to respecting the setting, number three, and setting in general, number two. Make sure you're not, if you're doing a dialect, like be respectful of the setting. Like if that you're doing a Spanish accent or something like that. Maybe there's not really a culture in that world that does that, or maybe it's fine. Just maybe check with the game master. So yeah, so that try to do a dialect that might be somewhat simulate what's in the setting is what I'm saying, and be respectful about it too. If you've got people at the table of nationalities that you're kind of like trying to emulate with your accent, maybe just be ask them if it's all right, or maybe make a new choice or something. But 9 times out of 10, it's fine. Everybody's cool and laughs about it. But we do live in sort of weird times with that. So and I understand. Be respectful. So okay, number 9. Moving on to using character backgrounds. Backgrounds. Using character backgrounds. So this is for you would think it's for the game master, right? But it's also for the PCs. So another way to create immersion is number 9, using character backgrounds. So the game master and there's a lot on the plate. Trust me. When I run for the youth kids, sometimes I have like 8 of them on Saturdays, 9 sometimes. I do it again on Sunday, a totally different campaign, and I run some online stuff. And I sometimes forget about, and they switch characters a lot, so I sometimes forgot. Like I'm like I cannot no longer remember what this character's background really is, other than maybe some notes they have on their sheet, which I do try to look at on occasion. It's really tough though, but I do try my best to do it. With a smaller group or with adult characters, it's a little easier to connect to their character backgrounds. And in Savage Kingdom, since I know that system and setting so well, it's actually really easy for me, which is nice. I feel much more relieved. And there's also a hard mechanic in Savage Kingdoms. There are weaknesses that are like flaws, and often part of that is your deep thing from your character's past. And there's certain talents that are so my memory kind of keys off of those things in particular. So if I can remember one or two of the character's weaknesses or flaws, and maybe one or two of their other things, then I usually have enough character background to pull from. So what I'm getting at is that, and so you don't have to make an entire session about someone's background, although that's also fine as well. Um, you don't have to hit on every single character's background in every session. However, if you can reference a character's background once or twice, maybe even a second character's in a session, I feel like that's a pretty good balance. Now there'll be other times where the character's background will come up even more, or maybe it even creates an entire adventure, which is even cooler. And maybe there's even a session or two where the background stuff doesn't really come up as much because there's other stuff going on that's causing that's more present based instead of past based, and the characters are focusing on that, and that's cool. That's what it's all about. But But yeah, if you can, to create immersion, if you can remember the characters' backgrounds from time to time. So when I first started, a little insight here. When I first started running, when I first published Savage Kingdoms, and it was game mastering, and obviously, I would. I even had a mechanical thing at the beginning of each session. I would roll randomly uh, on, like, if there were 4 characters that were PCs, I would roll a D4 or a D20 divided by 4, which is what I prefer because I like D20s. But since Savage Kingdom was just all D20s, so I would roll on that, and whatever character I would roll up, I would target that character's background, like something in the session I was going to make happen that had something to do. So if the character was oathbound, I might have a messenger come from that person who's oathbound to summoning them, or some other blast from the past that might occur. Or if a character had a phobia or an obsession, I would make sure that would come up, and that was good fun. I still kind of do that. I don't usually roll as much. I just kind of let it happen more organically now that I've gotten used to it and it's kind of in my system. I don't really have to do a die roll as much anymore. But occasionally I might. So anyway, it's kind of fun. So once you can connect the characters' backgrounds, whether it's flaws or strengths or in between, it makes it even more immersive for the player. So the player side of that is to make sure that you're creating a character background that fits in the setting. Going back to what I was saying earlier, being respectful of the setting and what the game master has created. So if everybody is doing that, being respectful and creating on top of each other and just adding, improv technique, layering over each other, you'll craft this incredible immersive experience. I promise you. And I think I'm going to end it with, oh yeah, I do have a number 10 actually. Number 10 is make eye contact for effect. I just kind of threw that in there. Um, so what that means is, so when you're storytelling, when you're describing, when you're doing kind of the narrative part of game mastering, in order to create more immersion and more severity, more gravitas, make eye contact. Not all the time. If you do it all the time, you lose the effect. But like when you're in normal descriptive mode, you're looking at people at the table and maybe even looking behind your screen. And then when it comes to a certain moment, make eye contact with that player and tell them, deliver this entire line to them or this entire descriptive. And that pulls them in. It's a storytelling contact uh, uh, maneuver. So, you're addressing the group like a storyteller does or a theater one-man show does. And then at some point, you're making eye contact with uh, a person in the audience, maybe someone you don't even know, maybe someone you do know, and that shows not only is that person pulled in, but everybody's watching is now like, oh man, he's like focusing on that one guy. What's he got to say? So yeah, little tricks like that. I could probably do a whole video about little theatrical tricks, which I've done before in the past, but they're like way down. Anyway, that's about it. It's like 37 minutes, which is fine. I was hoping to be around 35. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully that helps create immersion in your tabletop role-playing game experience, and everybody will be more happy about it and have a good time at your table. So thanks for following along. Talk to you guys again soon.